Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story is the tit-for-tat trade battle between the U.S. and China hitting a possible turning point. Beijing says its door is open for trade talks with the U.S., but is a deal really on the horizon, or is it just more political posturing? Prices are primed to skyrocket on packages from China worth less than $800. Details on how much shoppers still buying from Chinese e-shopping sites will have to shell out. President Trump touting $1 trillion in new investment during a meeting with top business leaders. That's as some Chinese firms quietly open factories in the U.S. to avoid tariffs. A critical step in countering China's dominance in critical minerals. The White House gives details on a minerals deal with Ukraine.
We secured a historic agreement to establish the United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund.
And President Trump threatening major punishments for countries buying Iranian oil. That says China remains Iran's biggest buyer. The trade stalemate between the world's two largest economies could soon see a major shift. Beijing says it's now considering trade talks with Washington. A Friday statement from the Chinese Commerce Ministry says China is currently evaluating talks with the U.S. The announcement comes after President Trump said Chinese officials have been in quiet contact with their U.S. counterparts. But until Thursday, Beijing had denied any such communication. It had also set preconditions for talks, demanding the U.S. first remove tariffs on Chinese goods and appoint a dedicated person for negotiations. Then, on Thursday, the rhetoric shifted, with Chinese officials asserting that it was U.S. that reached out for talks. Back in Washington, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, now also serving as interim national security advisor, told Fox News, quote, "The Chinese are reaching out. They want to meet. They want to talk." Rubio stepped into the role after Michael Waltz was nominated to represent the U.S. at the United Nations. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has highlighted the need for de-escalation. He called the current tariff burden unsustainable for China. He also noted that Beijing's export-driven economy is under increasing pressure and suggested that talks may only come once Beijing shows good faith. Looking at the markets, investors responded with optimism. The Hang Seng China Enterprises Index climbed more than 8% at the news, even as mainland Chinese markets remain closed for a public holiday. As both sides weigh their next move, all eyes are now on whether talks will turn to action or if this will be another stalled chapter in the long-running U.S.-China trade war. Shoppers eyeing cheap products from China may be in for a surprise. Starting now, items worth less than $800 will see big price hikes because of a new rule. NTD's Dina Monahan breaks it down.
We can't let it happen.
President Donald Trump signed an executive order in April to end the de minimis exemption for goods imported from China and Hong Kong effective May 2nd. The White House described it as a critical step in addressing the ongoing health crisis caused by the flow of synthetic opioids into the U.S. The de minimis rule had allowed goods valued at $800 or less to enter the country duty-free. Since 2016, shippers from China and elsewhere have taken advantage of the rule to send billions of small parcels into the U.S. Starting May 2nd, packages valued at $800 or less, shipped via international postal services, will face a duty of either 30% of the item's value or $25 per package, whichever is higher. That fee increases to $50 per package on June 1st.
China said Friday it is evaluating an offer from Washington to hold talks over the Trump administration's bruising tariffs.
The message from the communist nation's Commerce Ministry signaled a potential de-escalation in the trade war that has roiled global markets. It says the U.S. approached China to seek talks over the 145% tariffs and that Beijing's door was open for discussions. China is currently struggling with deflation due to sluggish economic growth and a prolonged property crisis. Trump said Wednesday there's a very good chance the two sides could reach a deal.
The days of de minimis exemptions are over, and shoppers on Chinese-owned e-commerce giants Temu and Shein are feeling the impact. Last week, both Shein and Temu tacked import charges onto their products up to 150%. This comes as the U.S. imposed tariffs of up to 145% on China's exports. Nearly half of the de minimis exports that had been entering the U.S. came from China. According to a U.S. Congressional Committee report, Temu and Shein alone accounted for 30% of those packages in 2023. Amazon Haul was also impacted. Its own low-cost Chinese imports had qualified for duty-free entry under the de minimis rule. As part of the shift, the U.S. Postal Service will now impose either a $25 flat fee or 30% of a package's value on any shipment below the $800 mark sent through China's postal services. Shipments mailed through carriers outside the U.S. Postal Service will face different fees. Packages valued less than $800 will face the usual tariffs of up to 145% instead. Many companies that source their products from China say they will no longer ship to the U.S. to avoid the high fees. However, retailers manufacturing goods outside of China are seeing new opportunities within the U.S. market. President Trump is celebrating a major surge in U.S. investment, touting $1 trillion in businesses and manufacturing commitments during an Invest in America event at the White House Wednesday. Surrounded by CEOs and high-tech industry leaders, Trump credited his trade policies and America First agenda with driving the investment wave, including major pledges from Apple, Nvidia, and SoftBank. The president emphasized that companies building in the U.S. face no tariffs, while imports, especially from China, are subject to steep levies. Officials say the boom is expected to generate nearly 500,000 jobs as global firms shift operations to American soil. Critics of the tariffs say they could spur inflation or cause supply chain disruptions. Meanwhile, some Chinese companies are quietly shifting production to the U.S. to avoid tariffs. A fitness equipment factory owner in southern China told NTD that this is the trend. To protect his identity, we have distorted his voice.
Many of my clients have advised us to open a factory and assembly line in the U.S.
Another business owner called Ryan Zhang told the South China Morning Post that he's in the process of opening a new factory in Texas to avoid tariffs. His company makes customized gifts. Leo Lee owns a business that makes electronic components. He set up a new factory in Nevada earlier this month. Zhu Ning has a consultancy that helps Chinese companies localize production in the U.S. He said in the past 4 months, he has received at least 100 inquiries. Despite that, an economist says there might be challenges ahead.
Many Chinese companies are not truly private. Oftentimes they have ties to state-owned companies, the Chinese military, or intelligence agencies, like Huawei.
Wong added the U.S. might tighten its scrutiny on these Chinese firms. He also noted that companies in sensitive industries might find it hard to set up shop in the U.S. A step forward in the U.S. effort to secure critical minerals to counter China. The materials are key to building weapons. The U.S. and Ukraine struck a minerals deal Wednesday. Here's what it covers.
We secured a historic agreement to establish the United States-Ukraine Reconstruction Investment Fund.
The White House on Thursday giving more details about a Ukraine minerals deal. President Trump previously said he wants to use Ukraine's rare earth minerals for the aid the U.S. is sending Ukraine.
It's meant to pay back the United States, this is the key point, for the hundreds of billions of dollars that our taxpayers have spent subsidizing the war in Ukraine. So it is repayment to the United States, and that's one of the most important points to understand about it.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also praised the agreement, but according to him, it doesn't include any of the aid the U.S. has already sent Ukraine.
The
agreement does not recognize any debt, and a fund is being set up. A reconstruction fund that will invest in Ukraine and generate returns here. This means joint work with America, based on fair terms.
The deal was signed as the Trump administration was celebrating its first 100 days in office. The press secretary says the agreement proves that Trump is serious about wanting to help Ukraine, as he said on the campaign trail.
This partnership represents the United States taking an economic stake in securing a free, peaceful, and sovereign future for Ukraine.
She added that the agreement will establish a joint fund, which will receive 50% of royalties, license fees, and other similar payments from natural resource projects in Ukraine. Rare earths are key ingredients for making various important things. They're needed for everyday items such as glass and light, but also to make cars, phones, and even military weapons such as tanks and fighter jets.
The deal comes a week after Trump ordered the U.S. to step up deep-sea mining. The ocean floor is home to a treasure trove of critical minerals, materials that are critical for making weapons. Trump noted that stockpiling minerals for defense is vital for U.S. security, and that without action, China would dominate the deep-sea mining industry. President Trump cranking up pressure on China. Trump said on social media Thursday that countries and individuals buying oil from Iran would face secondary sanctions and will not be allowed to do business with the U.S. China has been the largest buyer of Iranian oil thus far. Trump's comments come after the next scheduled round of U.S. talks with Iran were postponed. The U.S. is pushing for an end to Iran's nuclear program. The Trump administration has already hit Iranian oil with a series of sanctions, including sanctions on a China-based terminal storing oil from Iran. Vice President J.D. Vance touring the largest steel producer in the U.S. He says President Trump's first 100 days mark the beginning of an industrial renaissance here at home. NTD correspondent Jason Blair reports.
100 days under Donald Trump's leadership marks the beginning of the industrial renaissance in the United States of America.
Vice President J.D. Vance says that the Trump administration is working to make a new golden age of American manufacturing. He says they want to make it easier to make things in the U.S.
You guys, you're going to make it harder to manufacture in China. Isn't that bad? No, it's good. That's exactly what we want to do. They're saying you're going to make it harder for people to bring products in from overseas and undercut the wages of American workers. Exactly.
Vance toured Nucor Steel in North Carolina, the largest steel producer in the U.S. He was joined by U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin.
We believe that we can both protect the environment and grow the economy. We choose both.
The vice president said that the U.S. recently learned what happens when you outsource the things you need. He gave the example of critical medical supplies needed during the COVID-19 pandemic.
And it turned out all of those supplies came from the very country that set the virus loose on the entire world.
Also on Thursday, SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler joined Senators Joni Ernst and Roger Williams to announce a new bipartisan effort that will double the SBA's maximum loan size for small manufacturers.
Our small businesses will be at the heart of restoring American industry, helping to restore our economy, and reduce our reliance on foreign adversaries like the Chinese Communist Party.
Loeffler said that a similar effort will also be made in the House. Reporting in Washington, D.C., Jason Blair, NTD News.
Coming up, an annual report from the official of the U.S. Trade Representative calling out China for ongoing IP theft. Details on just how many counterfeit goods come from the country. While Congress has its hands full with budget debate, the House Select China Committee is pushing for another focus, Beijing's malign activities. And TikTok faces a $600 million fine for breaching rules in Europe. More on how the concerns of how European user data could be accessed by the Chinese regime. That and more after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. A powerful message from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative saying China continues to lead the world in intellectual property violations. An annual report from the office is highlighting what it calls serious concerns. And now Washington says enforcement actions are on the way. The USTR Special 301 report highlights several cross-cutting issues, including counterfeiting. According to CBP data, China continues to be the world's leading source of counterfeit and pirated goods. In fiscal year 2024, China and Hong Kong accounted for about 90% of these kinds of products seized by U.S. Customs. The report also stresses political interference in intellectual property disputes. Beijing recently issued new State Council provisions allowing Chinese agencies to retaliate against foreign entities who raise concerns over IP theft. China has appeared on the priority watch list nearly every year since the Special 301 report was first issued in 1989. As Congress moves to find consensus on the government budget, the bipartisan House Select Committee on the CCP is calling on lawmakers to focus on Beijing's malign activities. Democratic Ranking Member Raja Krishnamurti issued a statement Wednesday saying the CCP is, quote, rapidly expanding its authoritarian influence, advancing in AI, distorting global markets, and ramping up military aggression in the Indo-Pacific. He also called on the U.S. to step up global leadership and resilience amid this challenge. When it comes to dealing with the CCP, Democrats and Republicans have been debating on the practicality of tariffs and foreign assistance. But both parties acknowledge that China is a top adversary to the U.S. TikTok has been fined $600 million for sending European user data to China. The EU's privacy regulator said TikTok failed to show that data accessed by staff in China was afforded high levels of protection. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson has more for us from London.
The European Union's privacy regulators fined TikTok $600 million over concerns about how it protects user data, some of which can be accessed by staff in China. The regulator said TikTok failed to show that European user data was given protections required under EU law and did not address the potential use of this data by the Chinese regime. Ireland's Data Protection Commissioner, or DPC, which is leading the case, also ordered TikTok to suspend data transfers to China if its processing is not brought into compliance within 6 months. Under the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, the regulator can impose fines of up to 4% of global revenue. TikTok said it plans to appeal the ruling, and that it has used the EU's own legal framework to grant tightly controlled and limited remote access. TikTok, whose parent company ByteDance is based in China, has been under scrutiny in Europe and the United States over how it handles users' personal information. Western officials fears it poses a security risk over user data sent to China. Last month, President Trump said a deal to sell TikTok to a non-Chinese company was still very much on the table. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
New economic numbers show the economy shrunk in the first quarter, a first since 2022. President Trump says this was due to Biden-era policies, as the numbers were tracked before tariffs went into effect. Meanwhile, China's export model economy is in trouble, showing its lowest exports since the COVID-19 pandemic. To dive into this, NTD's Jack Bradley spoke to Kenneth Raposa, an industry analyst at Coalition for a Prosperous America.
Kenneth Raposa, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks, Jan. Appreciate it.
Now, the U.S. economy declined by 0.3% in the first quarter, down from the 2.4% expansion in the previous quarter. Stocks slumped a bit following the release of this data, but Trump blamed the numbers on Biden, posting on Truth Social, quote, "Our country will boom, but we have to get rid of the Biden overhang. This will take a while, has nothing to do with the tariffs, only that he left us with bad numbers. But when the boom begins, it will be like no other. Be patient." Ken, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, remember now, this is the first quarter, right? So tariffs did not kick in. They didn't kick in until April. That was Liberation Day, was April 2nd, right? So these have nothing to do with tariffs. You had a massive import front running of tariffs. That happened probably in February because tariffs were expected to come down the pike in April. But that he's right. These numbers here have nothing to do with the tariffs. That's not indicated in the data at all. So yeah, I mean, there's nothing I'll say about that other than these numbers are before the tariffs. That's coming next. So we'll see what that looks like.
And we're seeing hundreds of billions of dollars in new investment commitments in the U.S. since Trump took office in January, the latest of which is IBM. They announced this week that they'll invest $150 billion in U.S. manufacturing and investment. Here's Trump on this.
Apple, great company, was building everything in China. Now they just announced that they're spending $500 billion to invest in America, not in China. TSMC, the biggest chip maker in the world by far from Taiwan, they're spending $200 billion in the United States. Amazon, $21 billion. Johnson & Johnson, $55 billion.
Ken, is this a result of the tariffs, and where do you see this heading?
Well, I would say when it comes actually to semiconductors, companies like Intel and Taiwan Semiconductor, remember a lot of those were set up because of the CHIPS Act, and that was something that was bipartisan legislation signed into law by Biden. So, of course, the tariffs protect the CHIPS Act. You can't have a CHIPS Act and yet still have it easier to manufacture those goods in Asia. You have to have some sort of protective tariff to keep the CHIPS Act at least have a return on investment in those projects, the new fabrications, the fabs that are going up because of the CHIPS Act. So I would say a lot of the investments from Taiwan Semiconductor and Intel those are probably more likely to do with the CHIPS Act than they are tariffs, with tariffs being sort of a sense of that there's going to be some protection. Now, there are tariffs on semiconductors coming from China. Biden did that, not Trump. And there is what's called a Section 232. These are national security matters. These are issues related to tariffs that affect industries that the government deems a national security priority. And so there is an investigation into the Section 232 investigation into semiconductors. So maybe the industry senses that that's going to come down the pike soon as well. And so there's going to be an extra protection instead of just having the CHIPS Act, which is a giant subsidy or tax incentive for these companies to manufacture new plants and to expand existing ones in the United States.
And the latest figures show that exports in China fell to its lowest point since the pandemic, 2022. Manufacturing was its lowest in over a year there. Where's the Chinese economy headed at this rate?
China's economy is in trouble because China's economy is a export-led economy. It's not economy that is driven by its consumers like the United States. So they make things for the world, primarily the United States. So when you tell Chinese companies, large or small, that they can no longer stitch and sew goods for the American consumer, or they can no longer make widgets for the American multinationals that are going to turn those into cars and cell phones, it is a huge headwind for China. I don't even think it's measurable, because we will never know what China's unemployment numbers are, because the Chinese unemployment numbers are perennially stuck at 5%, no matter whether the economy is booming or doing poorly. So we have to assume that China is now facing the same thing that the United States faced once China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001. Instead of a China shock, they're facing a Trump shock, or let's get rid of the Trump word, an America shock, whereas we're saying we don't really want China to be the manufacturing hub of the United States anyway. Maybe Europe doesn't care, but the United States doesn't want that. And that is a huge blow to manufacturing labor in the United States, probably not unlike the blow that happened to the United States manufacturer from the late 1990s into the mid-2000s, because Chinese became the substitute for American blue-collar labor.
Fascinating insights. Kenneth Raposa, thank you so much for your analysis here.
Appreciate it.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you soon.